Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Lorenda Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is Building Online Resources That Last, Digital Exhibits and Collection Stewardship. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that as an organization of provincial scope, the BCMA recognizes that its members, today's presenters, and attendees occupy the lands and territories of BC's Indigenous peoples. We ask all of you to reflect on the places where you reside and work and to respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form its richness. As I mentioned, my name is Lorenda Calvert, and I'm your host for today. I am also the BCMA's Programs Coordinator. My pronouns are she, her, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please do email our office. Vanessa, our operations manager, is standing by to assist. A small bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments. I will read your comments or questions out to the hosts. There will be time at the end of the presentation reserved for Q&A. And the chat feature is at the bottom or top of your screen. It may be hidden, so you want to hover your mouse at the top or the bottom, and a taskbar or feature menu will emerge, and you can use the chat or Q&A function to ask questions. In an effort to improve accessibility, there is a live transcription service available. If you click on Live on Otter AI Live Notes View Stream, in the top left corner of this window, a separate website will open in your browser. As with many things this year, this is a new service to us and we are testing it out, so we appreciate any feedback you have on it. And there's that's pointing out what the chat feature is. This month's presenters are Kelly Black, Executive Director of Point Ellice House Museum and Gardens, Corey Davis, Digital Preservation Coordinator at UVIC, Dana McFarland, Librarian and Coordinator, eResources and Scholarly Communications at Vancouver Island University, and Matt Huculak, Digital Scholarship Librarian at UVIC. Thank you so much for our presenters joining us today. Now over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Lorenda, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Hopefully everyone can see my screen that I'm sharing with you. There's a couple of links up at the top here that we will be referencing later in the webinar. I just wanted to begin by introducing myself. Kelly Black, I am the Executive Director here at Point Ellice House Museum and Gardens in Victoria, and coming to you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, today the Esquimalt Nation and the Songhees Nation. Today, we are going to get started with a quote put here by one of our fellow presenters from a book that many of you are probably familiar with, The Lord of the Rings. And of course it goes, "And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend, legend became myth, and for 2,500 years, the thing passed out of all knowledge." This is what we're hoping won't happen with our digital exhibits, and we'll have more on that a little later. But I want to talk a little bit about why we're here today. Of course, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, there was this big push to get things online. And in February and March of this year, we at Point Ellice House had been working on a new exhibit called Springs and Scavengers, and it's about the history of waste and water here in Victoria. And this was a physical exhibit that we did end up launching in July, but of course in March things were quite uncertain. And that had me thinking quite a bit about how could I put the exhibit online, or how could I share information about the exhibit online? And how could I do this in a way that would stand the test of time, that could be preserved and accessible? For a lot of us in the museum sector or the GLAM sector, especially those of us in smaller museums, we often encounter these questions of, well, will this thing be around when I'm no longer in this position, or when my organization maybe no longer operates this site or museum or gallery? And here at Point Ellice House, I'm the only full-time staff member. And this is often something that I struggle with, is how can I ensure that stuff that we share with the public, be it exhibits or documents, will be out there beyond my time here at the organization. And so this brings us to one of the problems that we're going to talk about today, and that's if we don't plan for the long term, online exhibits can disappear or cease to function. And this isn't just a theoretical concern. And when I wear another hat, I'm an adjunct professor of history at Vancouver Island University. And many times I have encountered online exhibits or digital information about BC history that are incomplete or no longer accessible. And often these websites are things that I'd love to use in my teaching, but they can't be accessed anymore. And there's a couple of examples that I just want to share with you to give you a sense of what it looks like when your online exhibit is no longer accessible. This is from a Royal BC Museum exhibit celebrating the 150th anniversary of the colony of British Columbia. We had to access this in the Wayback Machine, used through archive.org, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But as you can see, this website no longer really functions. A lot of the graphics and images have disappeared, and we're left with an incomplete exhibit, and certainly something that I couldn't use for teaching. Similarly, here's a Virtual Museum of Canada website, and some of you out there might be working on Virtual Museum of Canada exhibits right now. This one's from the BC Forest Discovery Centre, and I teach the history of forestry and resource extraction in British Columbia. So when I came across this website, I was very excited. It has a database of primary sources. Unfortunately, it no longer functions. And that means that some of the ways that I might use this website for teaching doesn't help me, and it doesn't help my students. So I knew that this was a real issue that is out there, and something that I wanted to be aware of when planning. And so as any good historian or museum curator does, I reached out to my colleagues who know more about this, specifically my librarian friends who are on this webinar with us today. And one of the takeaways, I think, for today's webinar is to reach out to your local and regional libraries, be they at university and colleges or municipalities, and the digital librarians that are there. They're a wealth of knowledge, and they're going to share some of that with you today. And that brings me to my last point before I hand it over to Corey Davis from the University of Victoria, which is I'll be learning alongside all of you. I have a lot to learn, and this webinar came about by me asking the folks on this call if they could help me understand what I need to do to ensure things are preserved digitally. And so I'll be taking notes, and we'll have a period for questions after. But over to you, Corey.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Can everyone hear me relatively well? Okay, great. Yeah, and I'm going to be taking notes and learning too. I think this is even for, Kelly, you were mentioning kind of the level of staffing at your institution, at your at Point Ellice House. And, frankly, even the largest institutions in the country, Library and Archives Canada, we struggle with this issue that you've used some really great examples to raise. And really it's this idea of what we're calling digital preservation. And up at the University of Victoria, I have the honor of being the digital preservation librarian. And what we're really looking at is, I like to kind of reduce it to a personal example, and I use the sort of the digital shoebox paradox, right? And so grandma or grandpa had that box under the bed with all of those memories. We might use the technical term analog, things like letters and pictures and all that sort of stuff. And under the bed, or maybe on library shelves or in archives, those physical materials can survive quite a bit of what we might call benign neglect. And 100 years later, maybe the shoebox was from the Spanish flu back in 1918, and we can read the letters and learn about the experiences of regular everyday people during that time. when you sort of think in 100 years, the kids, you know, I've got a 4-year-old son, in 100 years when, you know, how do we preserve his voice over time? And so this is the idea of digital preservation. It's the people, and Matt's going to be talking about the labor that's involved, and it's substantial. It's the practices and the policies and the systems and the technology that we bring together to make sure that materials, in this case digital materials, are meaningfully accessible over time to whatever community they're important to. So that community might be your family, if it's about family stories, or in the case of a university library, it might be about the scholarly record and ensuring that researchers have access to that. So Matt is going to be giving us some really good examples of what this looks like practically, but I thought I'd just start there and just to give people a sense of it. And I really look forward to this conversation. Thanks again, Kelly, for bringing us together. And Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Corey. And thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Dana, for being here and for helping organize this. I just want to echo what the previous two speakers have said, in that this is a widespread problem, not just during COVID, but during normal times too. Corey and I have the benefit of working next to very highly trained, competent technical people at the HCMC, the Humanities Computing Media Center. And even there we run into challenges of a server that's hosted at the university gets decommissioned. What's on that server? Is there an important site that's about to be erased or lost? And one example from that is Martin Holmes at the HCMC was given access to one of these servers that was just about to be wiped, and he found the entire record of a scholar's scholarly output that they didn't know had been on this one particular server. And had he not intervened at that precise moment on that day, it would have been lost. So this is something that we continue to struggle with. Corey and I are both on a project called the Endings Project. If you Google that, that will give you an idea of the type of work we're doing in preserving digital humanities output. But if there's one thing that we can think about today is, before we begin any process of creating exhibits or creating digital tools or digital items, we need to think about its end. And unfortunately, that's also weird because we might have to think about our own end as well. A part of our survey of looking at digital projects was no one really thought about, well, what happens when I retire? Or what happens when some type of social relationship falls apart? Even though we can't imagine that these things happen. We don't want to imagine these things happen. They do happen in daily practice. So being able to plan for these eventualities or potentialities is really important. So today we're going to be talking about exhibits in particular. When Kelly reached out to us, we were thinking about in terms of how can the Point Ellice House show its material when it's in lockdown. One of the things we did was take a 3D video of the entire house and make that available online. So even though you couldn't necessarily go to the house, you could walk through with its head narrating what that experience was, what you were seeing. Exhibits are very important for museums and other memory institutions because we're usually dealing with an item level description of something and a story around it. And why exhibits? Well, we have these collections. We have those shoeboxes that Corey's talking about. In our archives, we have our boxes and our folders that aren't there necessarily or might not be discoverable if they're meant to be discoverable. Stories allow us to create context around those items so that people can be more engaged with them and to share the stories of those items and those contexts with audiences. It's also a way to make, when appropriate, knowledge publicly accessible in a way that goes beyond the physicality of a place, which is why so many of us are struggling right now, because access is both a physical presence issue as well as a digital issue. And if a system is built for preservation, it allows you to provide that long-term access to your objects. So if the labor has gone into making these things available, a good system preserves that labor as well. And it's also a surfacing tool of giving voice to collections that might traditionally have been voiceless to begin with, and to share our knowledge with a wider community. Why metadata? We're going to be talking a lot about metadata today and really focusing on this in our webinar. And I should note that after the presentation part, we're going to have a little tour of an out-of-the-box solution for this. But we've also created worksheets for you that will walk you through step-by-step of how to do the work we're doing today, addressing the issues that we're going to be talking about right now with metadata. One of the co-founders of Google, Vint Cerf, has been going around talking about the digital dark age, leaving historians without any knowledge of the 21st century, in fact, mid to late 20th century as well. Some of you may know that NASA accidentally or purposefully wrote over a lot of their magnetic tapes to preserve money, and by doing so lost a lot of information about the Apollo missions. Many of the materials that we're creating today will not be made available in the future for some simple reasons, and this is called the digital dark age. One of the reasons why there's such a difficult issue in preserving these digital files is rather than having a clay tablet or a piece of paper or vellum, things that we're really good at preserving traditionally, it's more than one thing to preserve a digital file. And we're constantly battling that perception in the public that, oh, if it's digitized, it's really easy. You don't have to worry about it. Well, no, because in order to preserve a digital file, you need the file, you need the software to open that file, and then you need the hardware to run the software to open the file, thereby creating a three-layer problem that we face, made even more complicated by the fact that, with planned obsolescence, these technologies are constantly evolving, and it's very hard to have a Mac computer from 1989 laying around to open up Microsoft Word. On top of that, there's copyright. Even if we may have access to Microsoft Word version 6.0, it's still under copyright, and it's illegal in many cases for librarians and archivists to load that software into emulated environments. So we face issues there. Countries like France have made it legal for memory institutions to break copyright in these specific cases, but there's still a lot of work we need to do in North America for this. A digital object also is not intuitive for your average public person who's thinking, oh, that's just a digital file. Here we have a picture of an extremely important item from our current time in COVID. And I'm wondering if anyone can tell me what this picture is. Go ahead and throw it in chat or unmute yourself and throw it out there. That's right, Sarah Benson Lord wins. This is Dr. Bonnie Henry's shoe, right? I don't know about you, but Dr. Henry has been a great solace for me and my family, listening to her expertise and talking about how to deal with the COVID situation. Well, it became popular in the press, and perhaps a little bit sexist at the same time, to focus on her shoes, because Dr. Henry has great taste in shoes. And John Fluvog ran with this, so to speak, and created her very own John Fluvog shoe to represent her style and her great taste. So we have this shoe that's been designed for a specific doctor in a specific place in British Columbia. How many of us think we'll remember, or a person from the future 10 years from now will know what this thing is, right? So what is a digital object? Well, it might be a picture of the shoe, or an analog universe, the shoe itself, but in order for it to be discoverable for both the system and for users, it needs to have its metadata. It needs a file name. It needs a title. It needs a creator, rights, location, language, dimensions, description, etc. And we're all used to this for creating our metadata, and this takes time. And I've added this big pink bubble to the left here to represent the labor it takes to actually describe something as simple as a shoe because that shoe needs to be contextualized so that in the future we know what this is and have some type of description to know its importance, right? And I don't know about you, but I like to hang out with archivists, and for some reason BC archivists love John Fluvog, and now they've got me addicted to this. So we have this shoe culture here within memory institutions, and this is sort of a part of that now with Dr. Bonnie Henry. And every profession has its metadata standards. This is another issue we face. For many of us working in memory institutions, we have the Getty metadata standards. And by the way, if you haven't read this book on the right, An Introduction to Metadata, published by Getty, it's freely available online as an HTML file. If you don't like reading online, you can also order a book, not free, but fairly cheap. Gives a wonderful overview of metadata and how it's created and why Getty has chosen to create the structure it's created. In Canada, we also have RAD, Rules for Archival Description. But sort of uniting all of these different standards is the Dublin Core. And not cool Dublin, Dublin, Ohio, no offense to anyone from Ohio, where librarians and archivists gather to determine sort of 15 core fields that will represent metadata for any object across the globe. So we can link that data. So a lot of systems that are being developed focus solely on Dublin Core because it is a little bit easier to work with than other professional standards that we're used to. So what are the out-of-the-box solutions for 2020? The one I work with a lot, both in terms of teaching and in the library, is a system called Omeka. There are 3 types of Omeka. One of them is called Omeka Classic. That's sort of the original. And this was created by digital humanities practitioners, librarians, to create a digital collections asset management system. It was meant to be a cheap, install on your own server system where you could upload and describe digital objects. As that service grew, a lot of memory institutions realized, well, wait a second, we have a lot of collections, but we want to do way more exhibits than just one. So Omeka S was developed as a way of having a common core collection that can then be divvied up into different exhibits. So that's Omeka Classic and Omeka S. The problem with these 2 systems is that you have to run them on your own server, and many people don't have access to that type of technical expertise to run that, which brings us to our next slide, which is the cloud. And of course, there are still a lot of problems with the cloud and backup and data governance and so forth. But if this is your only option, there is something called Omeka.net. And this is a company that's run out of a library where they host your collections based on this tiered plan. So if you want 2 exhibits and 20 plugins and 2 gigabytes of storage, it costs $35 a month US, and it goes up from there. So for many of us, this type of out-of-the-box solution might be the only thing we have access to. Fortunately at UVIC, we do run a couple servers with Omeka for our class projects and so forth. But if I were in a situation like Kelly, this would be the first place I might consider going. The other great thing about Omeka.net is it is run by librarians and digital humanist type people. They will export your data for you and give it to you wrapped up, so you can transfer it with your structured data at a later date if you need to. So this is what Omeka.net looks like. It's a web publishing platform for digital collections. Now, mind you, it's the digital collections that's the most important part about Omeka. It's collections first, exhibits second. In fact, today, when we create our first item in a collection, we'll actually have to go through the process of installing the exhibit plugin, which sort of sits on top of the asset management system in order to deliver the exhibit. So think of Omeka first and foremost as that collections manager. It's interactive in the sense that there are different themes and different pages you can install that include mapping data, that include visual images, moving images, and again, huge issue for many of us working in digital scholarship today, it's also responsive. That means it can be shown on the iPhone or whatever digital device someone happens to be accessing our institution through. At UVIC, I think we're up to 60% of our hits being from cell phones or mobile devices, which means we have to completely reimagine how we design our sites. So we're moving away from that 3-pillar or 4-pillar library design so that things float and respond well to small screens. Omeka has that built in. What is an item in Omeka? And when we create an item in Omeka, it's both that digital file, and let's pretend we're uploading a JPEG, but it's also that structured metadata around it. And I like to describe it as sort of that core of an apple. If we think about the center of an apple, all those little seeds representing the metadata, and the apple itself as the whole representing that item. So in Omeka, you have on the screen, you'll see at the bottom, you have your values, which is the metadata schema you choose. Dublin Core is preferred, but you can choose your own schema if you want. Media is where you actually upload your image. So the image is separate from the values, but it's still structured. The reason you do this is because, of course, if 5 years from now, we create an even better image format that allows us to have a really high quality image at a very small size, we can just switch out the media without having to redo all of our metadata. So even that type of planning is involved here when it comes to the creation of Omeka. There's also mapping. And then for those of you who work in distinct communities, there's also tags, which provide a way to provide folksonomies for people who want to describe items in their own way, rather than in a librarian or archival way. So here are some resources for you. Literally 2 days ago, a colleague at UCLA, Miriam Posner, wonderful teacher, made public her class on museums in the digital age. So I've included her link in this slideshow, and you'll have the link to this slideshow as well to revisit these links. She has a wonderful reading list of what it's like to be in a museum in a digital age. So I highly recommend that resource. For metadata, I love these 2 books on the left. I've already mentioned the Getty, but I also want to mention the book from MIT, Introduction Series, where it looks at those larger issues of metadata in the world, but also talking about linked data, which will, of course, be more and more important for us as we move forward, as we link our resources. And I think Corey or Kelly, you wanted to speak to any other resources on this page?
I think we're going to hand it over to Dana, but I'll just say that I've already mentioned archive.org, which crawls the internet and saves pages. So if you ever come across something, whether it's your own website or somebody else's that you think, oh, I hope this exists in the future, you can always archive it in the Wayback Machine. Some of you might be familiar with it, but I would definitely check that out. It's a great place to start. Perhaps Dana wants to mention some of these others, or Corey, and then we can talk about looking ahead to the future.
You go right ahead there, Dana.
I think we have a number of infrastructure possibilities listed here that may or may not fit the purpose of organizations depending on what it is they really need to do. So I think we've included them here just as possibilities for folks to explore, and are open to perhaps further conversation as people may have questions or want to know more about them. Okay, so I think this is me, and it's just a place in the presentation, I think, where we want to return to a little bit more of a reflective stance. In conversations about this session, we returned repeatedly in our presenter group to the fact that there are any number of strategies and technologies that may fit a given preservation scenario. And these exist on a spectrum of more simple or more complex. But by defining guiding principles that are related to stewardship objectives, standards-based access, ethics of care, and certainly supporting communities and having a voice, we have a good place to begin. And working from those sorts of principles, we can look at the resources that we have and any gaps that we may feel that we have. And perhaps look then for partners to collaborate in taking concrete steps of the kinds that, that Matt has been describing before now, and Corey and Kelly. And we can do that even if we start small. So thinking here of a couple of examples that are illustrated on the slide from the mid-Vancouver Island area where I live. There is currently a collaboration of the Nanaimo Museum and the Nanaimo Archives, for one instance, where they're gathering community stories to do with the pandemic. Vancouver Island University Library, where I work, can bring capacity to that initiative by offering preservation services of various kinds. And by doing that, helping to ensure that those sorts of stories are brought forward for the future. We don't have to replicate the work, we can augment the work. A similar collaboration occurred between VIU and Vancouver Island Regional Library to preserve Canada 150 stories that were gathered by the public library branches of Vancouver Island Regional Library across the island and up and down the coast. In these cases, preservation actions could be taken because the content was gathered or presented not with the end in mind necessarily, as Matt described earlier, but because the content was gathered or presented using standards and technologies that allowed for the preservation activity to take place. So this is what we're talking about, looking at the continuum. So taking practical steps toward digital preservation does mean acknowledging that there are no perfect platforms. There are supported platforms though. And I think if we do anything helpful today, I hope to introduce some options and technologies to consider and to explore together with GLAM allies and community allies that you may have so that we can serve better the communities that we seek to serve. So at this point, we're opening a space for questions about the presentation up until this point, and then we'll hand over after that for Matt to talk about how to get hands-on with Omeka. And I know we have one question. Taylor's been waiting for a while. So Taylor, I'm going to turn your mic on so that you can ask your question. Can you talk now?
I think you can only invite someone to unmute themselves. I don't know if you can fully unmute themselves. Oh, and Taylor said that was a mistake. Sorry.
No pressure, Taylor.
If anyone has any questions, they can pop it in the chat where we can read them out.
Please, no questions about Dr. Bonnie Henry's shoes, unless it's metadata related.
Hey, that's why I'm here. I'll take those questions.
Not seeing any in the Q&A or the chat. Someone does have a pair of the shoes. They have a green pair of Flugflog shoes. So passing that on to Matt.
Excellent choice.
Well, we'll, oh, here we go. Here's a question.
Is there any way to import data into Omeka from other databases?
Great question. Yes, there is a plugin called the CSV importer that allows you to bring in structured data from other databases. The way Omeka works is you have your core system, which is that collections manager, and then you have access to a series of plugins that sort of add functionality to it. If you're running it on your own server, you can install as many plugins as you want. There's a very vibrant community out there, particularly on GitHub, but you can also find them at the Omeka website, where you can basically find what you're looking for. It's a lot like WordPress in that way. If you've ever used WordPress before, you might be thinking, oh, I need to import a bunch of stuff from this other database. Has anyone ever had that problem before? And in many cases, the answer is yes. And some people have created tools for that. So specifically here, it is a CSV importer. Second question, I find that digital humanities can be a new concept for museum folks. Can you give a brief overview of what DH is and how museums can get involved? Another great question. So my background is in humanities, and I can tell you I was dragged kicking and screaming into the digital world. And I don't want to say digital humanities is like that, but in many cases, so much of scientific research and social scientific research is already digital. Whereas in the humanities, we're still sort of asking ourselves, where do we fit into digital tools and digital tool creation? So digital humanities is sort of a movement, very strong movement around the world, where humanists are asking questions about technology. So the normal humanist questions like the ethics of access to technology, etc., but also using technology for their work. And in many cases, that might be creating a digital archive, or you may have heard about distant reading, where you're taking large chunks of text and having a computer do topic modeling on it, or determining authorship. So did Shakespeare write this, or did another person write this? Because we all have our linguistic quirks, and computers can read those cues and determine, okay, Shakespeare wrote these 5 lines, and John Kidd wrote these 3 lines down here. So that's sort of the type of work digital humanists do.
Thank you. We also have a question here from Kitimat Museum. Here at the Kitimat Museum and Archives, we have several exhibitions online now, but we have a few images that have been uploaded more than once. Is it possible to go back and fix it so one photo can be cross-referenced for multiple exhibitions? Or is this information that can be easily found via Google, like the how-to information? And Kelly suggested Corey or Dina might want to answer the question.
He's trying to give us equal time. Thank you, Kelly. Very nice. But Matt, I think this is possible in Omeka, right? Depending on what you're using, you put the image into a repository and then link to it. And you can do that from one instance of it to multiple exhibits. Do you want to answer? Or I don't know. Matt, do you know?
It really depends on the system that's being used. So let me just see if I can Google this.
Is it Omeka that's being used? Perhaps Denise could let us know what they're using.
There's also ways to just,
Yes,
yeah, okay. Well, that's Omeka S, isn't it, Matt, where it's a repository where you can build multiple exhibits on top of single instances of the image in a repository. Are we going to be covering any of that in the little 20-minute workshop?
I don't think so, but if this is something that we wanted to follow up on, I'd be happy to work with anyone one-on-one if you have these types of questions.
Lorenda's going to share our contact information, so feel free to follow up with us, Denise, about the specific question. And because we have about 20 minutes left, we are going to shift over. Matt's going to share his screen, and we're just going to walk people through how you can get started with Omeka. And of course, the slides that we've shared today throughout this webinar will also be made available afterwards, as will the recording, and Lorenda will go through that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, can everyone see this sort of teal green image? Great. So if you go to omeka.net, this is what you'll see. It's just sort of the introductory page that shows you here are the type of things you can do. But if you go to pricing, which is a little bit, you know, it will tell you what type of plans are available to you. Now, because I'm already logged into Omeka, you can't see this, but let me see if I can bring it up here. If you're not logged in, you should see a little box up above these tiered plans that say start your free Omeka trial. And here is where you can click start your free trial. And free trial makes it sound like it's going to expire. It doesn't. It just limits you on how much data you can upload to the system. So this is a great way to test out whether or not Omeka will work for you. So if you click on start your free trial, it will bring you to this email confirmation, etc. But once you do log in, you get to your sites page. And if you're on the free plan, you're allowed one site. And this omeka.net is sort of a multi-tenancy platform so that if you did purchase upgrades, you could run multiple sites out of your place. I personally like working with images of cats because we all know that's why the internet was invented, particularly kittens in museums. So I created a website called museumkittens.omeka.net as my site. And I can view my site here, but I don't have anything in there. So I can go to Manage Site, and this brings me to the administration panel of Omeka. And the first thing I want to show folks is that there are two main navigation panes in Omeka. There's the top navigation. And sorry, this is my colleague Charlotte. I had to borrow her email address because I ran out of free accounts that I could possibly use. So she generously gave me her email. You have your plugins that you can install. You can change how it appears. You can also invite multiple people to participate in the building of your site, and you can give them different levels of access. So if it's someone you trust, you can make them an administrator, or if you have a worker, student worker who's only there for a week or two, but you want to train them on how to use Omeka, you can give them write privileges, but not delete privileges. On the left-hand side, you have your item and exhibit space navigation. And in Omeka, items really is the number one thing. You need to populate your system with items before you can do anything. So we're going to walk you through the steps of actually creating an item because everything in the system builds on top of that. And today we're going to add Dr. Bonnie Henry's shoe to the system so that we can create that structured metadata for the future. And to do that, I click on Add an Item. And I'm immediately brought to the Dublin Core metadata screen. I do not want to embarrass myself in front of metadata librarians, so I'm going to open this up to everyone. If we were to give this item a title, what should we call it? Go ahead and just type it into the chat box, and I'll type it in because I'm not taking responsibility for this. Coronavirus pink. I like it. We have a subject field here, and I should note that if you're not familiar with Dublin Core, there is a wonderful web page that you can go to. Dublin Core element set, where you can go back and forth to determine what the thing is. So it's a name given to the resource. So I noticed there is someone who's asked, what was the official name given by Fluvox? And I think it is Dr. Henry, the Dr. Henry shoe. So let's call it the Dr. Henry shoe, or Dr. Bonnie Henry shoe. The subject, and for those of you that work in metadata, this could be broad, but it could be clothing, or it could be You know, the coronavirus might be our subject. Description is where we can provide that contextual material. So I'm writing, this is the shoe created by the BC shoemaker John Fluebach to honor the work of Dr. Bonnie Henry. What is Dr. Henry's official title? Provincial Health Officer of British Columbia, Canada. The creator is John Fluebach. The source, I'm not sure. The publisher, I'm not sure. The date, I'm just going to put 2020, that infamous year. This doesn't force us to use a certain number of metadata fields, but the more we can add, the better. Now, here we have Dublin Core, and now we have the item type metadata, and this is much more broad, and in this case, it's a still image. We're restricted in Dublin Core to these limited item type metadata sets, so I'm going to choose still image. And files is what I was talking about, where we then upload the JPEG or the TIFF or whatever we happen to be opening. And I recommend only uploading one file per item unless it happens to be a compound object. If it is a compound object, you can add multiple files to a single item. So that's why there's that green button here. One thing I always forget to do, and I recommend, is that when it's ready to be public, you need to check the box public. You'll always be able to see the image as you create the exhibit, but when you go to publish it, anything you haven't checked published will not be visible to someone who's not logged into the system. And then I can add tags here. And for me, naturally, if I were looking for this in the future, I might put shoes, COVID, well, those might be the two things I would add to this. And then I would add item. So you now see that in our items collection, we have an item finally. Now collections allow us to separate our items into those professional containers that we use. So if you're working at a museum and you have a collection of, you know, footwear, et cetera, you have to put in some basic Dublin Core metadata to name that collection. Etc. Make that public if you want it to be visible to the public. If you don't, this might just be an administrative collection, so you don't need to make it public, and click Add Collection. So under Collections, you see here we have our collections list. We also can separate by item types or add item types should the Dublin Core not capture the item type that you have. And for many of us working in BC, of course, there might be something that is in an oral history or an email or an event. So you can add your own item types as well. You can also manage all your tags. So if you have not installed the exhibit plugin yet, you won't see this here. So let me show you how to do that. To install plugins, you go to the plugins interface in the top, where you're given a list of free plugins that you can use in your site, including coins. For those of you that use Zotero or other citation managers, if you want people to be able to cite your material, by adding this coins plugin, it will read the metadata and allow that item to be imported to bibliographic managers like Zotero. Here's that CSV import plugin that I believe Kevin asked about, and the exhibit builder. So again, Omeka is more of a collections management system. To build an exhibit, you need to install the plugin, which allows you to create that exhibit story. There's also a Library Congress suggest function, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on what your need is, you can install them here. I've installed the exhibit builder. So now I can see the exhibits tab on this other left-hand navigation bar. So here under exhibits is where I can actually edit my exhibit. And again, we're not editing the item, we're editing the exhibit now. And I've created kittens in museums. That's no longer appropriate since we're focusing on the shoes now. So we can call this Shoes of COVID-19 is my exhibit title. The slug is an easy way for people to navigate to your site. It shouldn't be more than one word. And I'm going to call this shoes and credits. I'm going to give credit to John Fluvog and Dr. Bonnie Henry and the BC Museum Association, let's say. And then I can describe this, an exhibit for shoes of provincial health officers, tags, shoes, museums. I'm also allowed to have a couple themes, 3 themes. I like the current public theme, so I'm going to keep it there. I can also use a summary page to start off my exhibit. I don't like to use that. I like people to go directly into my exhibit, so I'm unchecking that. And then I can also include a cover image. So I might choose the shoe as my cover image for the exhibit. Now again, it needs to exist in the system for it to be available here. Now, at this point, I can save my changes. You'll note that it's not public yet because I might not want this to be public yet. That's the exhibit metadata stuff. Down below is where we actually build our exhibit in the pages area. And to add a page, I'm just going to delete these. So I'm going to delete those 2 things and then save, which will remove those pages. I'm going to add a page. And I'm going to call this page Dr. Henry's shoes. The menu link title might just be John Fluvog's influence. And the slug will be shoes again, perhaps. Now, in this limited Omeka, I have 4 different layouts I can choose. I can choose file with text, so I can show the file and then have exploratory text or interpretive text around it. I can just have a gallery of images that people click on to have a visual engagement with my material, text only or file only. So maybe you have a PDF of things. I particularly like file with text, so I'm going to select that. This is the only thing about Omeka I don't like. When I select this, I now have to click Add New Content Block. Then that appears. So here, I'm going to click on Add Item. I only have 1 item, so I'm going to select it. And then I can provide a caption. The Dr. Bonnie Henry shoe. I can apply that. So that exists there. And then here is where I can put in my exploratory text. In 2020, Canada was affected by the global pandemic, and Dr. Bonnie Henry became a well-known public health official who also happened to wear great shoes in honor of Dr. Henry, BC shoemaker John Fluvog created the Dr. Bonnie Henry shoe. Once that's done, I have to hit Save Changes. And I can either add another content block to this page or add another page. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to add another page or another content block. Let's go ahead and view what people are going to see on the web. And so this is what they'll see, given how we've set up our exhibit right now. They'll see the item to the left and that interpretive material to the right. And if I click on this, it should bring me to the metadata page, which allows us to link this with other systems, should that be something we want to do in the future. I'm just going to go back to this page. If we didn't like that layout, you'll notice down here there's a little triangle, but if we click on that triangle, it gives us a couple layout options. I might not like that the image is on the left. I can change that so it's on the right. I might want to have a thumbnail or square thumbnail instead of a full-size image. And I can change the captions area. So that gives me a little bit of control. So the way I use this particular function is if I have maybe 3 to 5 images on a page, I'll stagger them. So one image will be on the left, one image will be on the right, one image will be on the left. That gives me control over that. The only thing to really watch out for is when you select the layout, you do need to add the new content block and then hit Save Changes. It's been a few times where I've added a content block and forgot to hit save and lost information. So always hit save. To change your appearance, you can go into different areas to see what other themes look like. Here is where you can add your users. So if I wanted to invite Kelly or Dana or Corey to participate in this, I can give them superpowers, or I can give them researcher or contributor powers, all depending on what role I'd like them to have. I can change the settings of the page. And again, this is something you can experiment with depending on how you want your site to look, how people search, item type elements, as well as the API. And if you do decide to move to a different system, there is an API here from which you can pull your material into that system. Again, another reason why I recommend Omeka, because it is open source, it is open, and it's made for librarians and memory institutions in mind. So you're not trapped in this system. Up here is your dashboard. That again brings you back to your sites where you can edit your personal information. If for whatever reason you don't want to participate in Omeka anymore, you can deactivate your account and so forth. So again, this system is out of the box. It's not necessarily perfect, but it does give us some way of engaging our public using items in an exhibit fashion. So I'm going to end there and pass it on to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We're just about at the end of this, and I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending, and to my colleagues on the panel, thank you for sharing this information. And we are all accessible through our institutions, through the University of Victoria for Matt and Corey, through Vancouver Island University for myself and Dana, and of course through Point Ellice House for me. But I hope some of you are inspired by this and are starting to think a little bit about the long-term preservation of the things that you put out there on the internet, so we don't have error messages in the future when we go to check out your awesome exhibits. I'll pass it over to Lorenda, who will share a little bit more about how you can access this information going forward.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I'm just going to skip over my next slide, as that's a question slide, and we already took some earlier. I just wanted to thank you, Kelly, Corey, Dana, and Matt, so much for joining us today. I absolutely learned a lot, so that was super, super valuable for me, and I'm sure it was very valuable for our attendees. I also just wanted to encourage any of our attendees today to join us in October. Next Wednesday, we have a webinar, Measuring What Matters, Tracking Data and Measuring Impact at your Cultural Heritage Institute. And the Wednesday after that, we have a webinar, Better Living Through Graphic Standards, Simple Steps to Appearing Like You Know What You Are Doing. I also want to encourage you to reach out via the email that will be coming with this webinar recording. You can fill out a survey that helps us decide the future of our webinars. And do consider joining us in 2020 and beyond by becoming a member of the BC Museums Association. You have access to funding opportunities, free webinar participation, reduced registration fees, and access to professional development resources, and so much more. Again, I wanted to thank you all for joining me today, and have a very wonderful afternoon. Thanks so much. Take care.